The story of slavery is not merely a history of labor. It is a history of lives stolen, families torn apart, identities erased, and humanity stripped away. Long before Europeans arrived on the African continent, African societies were rich, diverse, and complex. Kingdoms like the Ashanti, Dahomey, Oyo, Congo, and Mali had intricate political structures, sophisticated trade networks, vibrant cultural practices, and thriving economies. Women in many societies held critical roles in trade, agriculture, and spiritual life. Yet all of this would be violently disrupted by the rise of the transatlantic slave trade, which reshaped Africa and the world. European powers, Portugal, Spain, France, and England, arrived on African coasts seeking wealth, resources, and labor for their colonies in the Americas. They relied on alliances with local rulers and intermediaries to capture people, often prisoners of war, criminals, or those accused of debts. Captives were forcibly marched hundreds of miles to coastal forts, often in chains, enduring hunger, exhaustion, disease, and abuse along the way. Families were separated, fathers from children, husbands from wives, siblings from each other, sometimes permanently. Languages were lost, cultural practices suppressed, and religious rituals forbidden. European traders treated these human beings as commodities, assessing them for strength, health, and reproductive potential. Women were assigned a dual value. They were laborers who could work the fields or perform domestic chores, and they were bearers of future enslaved generations. Their reproductive capacity became a critical factor in economic calculations. Pregnant women were often exploited to produce children who would inherit the same condition of slavery, ensuring a self-reproducing labor force. Men were valued for their physical strength, capable of enduring the most grueling work, but women's roles, though different, were equally essential to the economy of slavery. Resistance was constant, even under extreme conditions. Some captives fought back during raids or attempted to escape during the forced marches. Others resisted culturally and spiritually, preserving languages, music, religious practices, and communal rituals. These acts of defiance, often subtle and quiet, were acts of survival and of maintaining human dignity in the face of dehumanization. The economic machinery driving slavery was enormous. European colonies in the Americas depended on enslaved labor to produce sugar, tobacco, rice, and later cotton, commodities that fueled global trade and enriched European powers. The labor of enslaved Africans created the wealth that built cities, funded empires, and shaped international markets. Women were central to this system, not only as workers, but as mothers whose children would also become property, a living extension of the owner's investment. By the 17th century, the transatlantic slave trade had become a global enterprise. Millions of Africans were uprooted from their homes and transported across the Atlantic in a system designed to extract wealth and suppress humanity. This chapter of history is not just about economics, it is about the human cost, the trauma, and the resilience of those forced into bondage. Understanding these roots is essential to grasp the full scope of the suffering endured, especially by women, whose vulnerability and exploitation would define much of the brutality of slavery in the centuries to come. The journey from Africa to the Americas, known as the Middle Passage, was one of the most harrowing aspects of the transatlantic slave trade. For men, women, and children, it was a voyage of terror, violence, and dehumanization. Captured Africans were crammed into the holds of ships, sometimes dozens of people per square meter, chained together, with barely enough room to sit or lie down. Sanitation was virtually non-existent. The stench of human waste, sweat, vomit, and disease filled the air. Food and water were scarce, and illnesses such as dysentery, smallpox, and malaria swept through the ship, killing many before the journey even ended. Estimates suggest that between 10% and 20% of captives died during the passage, though the psychological trauma affected every survivor. Women faced unique vulnerabilities during this voyage. Enslaved women were often housed near the officers' quarters, rather than chained below deck like men, which gave sailors and officers constant access to them. Sexual assault was widespread, driven by a combination of opportunism, power, and racist ideology. Many European sailors believed in myths that African women were inherently promiscuous, a belief used to justify their abuse. These women had no ability to consent, no legal or social protection, and resistance often led to punishment or even death. Historical records describe forced exercise routines where women were made to dance on the quarterdeck. While the exercise was framed as necessary for health, it also exposed their bodies to sexual harassment from officers and crew. The conditions of the ship itself were deliberately structured to control and dehumanize. Men were often kept in chains on the main deck, separated from women by wooden barricades, while women remained in spaces easily accessible to officers. Officers could pass through women's quarters to reach the deck, creating a constant environment of fear and sexual threat. Some sailors explicitly chose the trade for the opportunity to exploit women, and captains often facilitated this, assigning women to favored crew members or allowing privileges in exchange for sexual submission. Psychological trauma was as intense as the physical suffering. Enslaved Africans were stripped of identity, names, and culture, forced to navigate a world where every aspect of their lives, from movement to food to human connection, was controlled by strangers. Women, in particular, endured the dual burden of physical confinement and sexual predation. Children were at constant risk, often witnessing abuse of their mothers or being abused themselves. Mothers had no control over their reproductive capacity. Pregnancies resulting from rape increased the value of their ownership, and newborns automatically became part of the enslaved workforce. Despite these horrors, there were instances of resilience and resistance. Some women maintained cultural practices through song, prayer, and storytelling, preserving language and spiritual traditions even in confinement. Some captives planned uprisings on ships or resisted through subtle acts of defiance, such as refusing to eat or attempting to escape during stops along the coast. These acts, though risky, were a testament to human endurance and a refusal to be entirely broken by cruelty. The Middle Passage was more than a physical journey. It was a psychological and cultural rupture. It stripped away freedom, dignity, and family bonds, laying the foundation for the brutal systems of slavery in the Americas. For women, it added a sexualized dimension of violence that would continue on plantations and in households. Understanding. The Middle Passage is essential to understanding the lived reality of enslaved Africans and the long-lasting effects of trauma, especially on women, that persisted through generations. After surviving the horrors of the Middle Passage, enslaved Africans were met with another brutal reality: the arrival in the Americas and the infamous auction block. This stage of slavery was a public spectacle of dehumanization, where people were treated purely as commodities to be bought and sold. Ships docked at ports such as Charleston, New Orleans, Havana, and Saint-Domingue, unloading men, women, and children who were then subjected to inspection by European and colonial buyers. Families who had already endured separation during capture were often torn apart once more, as husbands, wives, mothers, and children were sold to different owners with no regard for personal bonds or familial connection. Women faced a particularly cruel form of scrutiny. Beyond assessing physical strength for labor, buyers evaluated women for fertility and reproductive potential. Pregnancy, youth, and health could increase a woman's market value, while illness or age could diminish it. This system not only commodified women's labor, but also turned their bodies into tools for generating future property. Inspectors often publicly exposed women, forcing them to remove clothing so that buyers could examine their physical condition and reproductive capability. Such acts were not only degrading, but reinforced the message that these women had no rights, no autonomy, and no dignity. Auctioneers would call out the supposed qualities of enslaved women and men, highlighting their physical prowess, endurance, and potential for obedience. Buyers sometimes requested favorites, women they believed would be suitable for domestic service or sexual exploitation. In many cases, these transactions were accompanied by coercion, threats, or even outright violence, ensuring compliance. The psychological trauma of being displayed, inspected, and sold was profound. Enslaved people often faced the terror of not knowing where they would be sent, what work awaited them, or whether they would ever see their families again. Children were not spared from this treatment. They were evaluated for potential labor and sold separately from their mothers. Mothers had no legal claim over their children, and the thought of permanent separation was a source of immense grief and anxiety. This system was designed to strip individuals of personal identity and familial connection, leaving them dependent entirely on the whims of their owners. Despite the brutality of arrival and auction, enslaved women employed subtle strategies for survival. Some sought the protection of particular household members, hoping that being assigned to a domestic role might reduce exposure to field labor or sexual abuse. Others built quiet networks of support with fellow captives, sharing knowledge, food, and moments of emotional solace. Maintaining cultural practices through song, prayer, or storytelling was another form of resistance that helped women and children retain a sense of identity and humanity amid the constant threat of violence. The auction block was more than an economic transaction. It was a deliberate tool of social control. By publicly displaying human beings as property, European and colonial powers reinforced a system where dominance, fear, and submission governed all interactions. Women, in particular, were subjected to the dual oppression of labor expectations and sexual vulnerability, a pattern that would continue on plantations and in households across the Americas. Understanding the arrival and auction process is crucial to recognizing the systemic nature of slavery and the specific vulnerabilities faced by enslaved women, whose exploitation combined physical, psychological, and sexual dimensions that left enduring legacies across generations. Life on plantations was the central reality of slavery in the Americas, a daily existence defined by exhaustion, oppression, and constant surveillance. Once enslaved Africans survived the Middle Passage and the auction block, they were transported to the plantations where they would live under the authority of their owners, overseers, and sometimes the owners' families. The plantation was more than a workplace. It was a site of control, social hierarchy, and violence. For enslaved women, life on a plantation meant performing both the physically demanding labor of the fields and the intricate, time-consuming work of the household. In the fields, women worked alongside men, tending crops such as cotton, sugar, tobacco, and rice. While men were often assigned the heaviest labor tasks, women frequently performed multiple roles simultaneously. From planting seeds and clearing land to harvesting crops and preparing them for shipment, the work was grueling and relentless. On rice and cotton plantations in the southern United States, women were often in the fields from before sunrise until after sunset, enduring extreme heat, exhaustion, and the constant threat of physical punishment for falling behind. Their labor was central to the economic success of plantations, yet it was uncompensated and controlled entirely by their owners. Domestic labor added another layer of exploitation. Many enslaved women were assigned as cooks, nannies, housekeepers, and seamstresses within the planter's household. These roles required a high level of skill, but they did not guarantee safety. Women in domestic positions were often subjected to sexual harassment or assault by male members of the household, including owners, overseers, and visiting guests. They were also responsible for preparing meals, cleaning the house, nursing the planter's children, and attending to every need of the family, often while still maintaining their own children in the background. For pregnant women, there was no reprieve. They were expected to continue laboring both in the fields and the house, and to return to work soon after giving birth. Their children were often raised by other enslaved women, a system that ensured that mothers' labor remained productive despite pregnancy or childbirth. The dual burden of field and domestic labor created a unique and relentless strain for enslaved women. They were simultaneously exploited for their physical labor, their reproductive capacity, and their ability to sustain households. The combination of these roles left little room for rest, personal safety, or autonomy. Despite these challenges, women developed strategies to cope and resist. Communal networks allowed women to share childcare responsibilities, knowledge of herbs, and cultural traditions. Singing, storytelling, and practicing spiritual rituals were not only acts of cultural preservation, but also subtle forms of resistance to the constant psychological pressure imposed by plantation life. Plantation life also reinforced strict hierarchies and control mechanisms. Overseers monitored labor closely, and punishments such as whipping, confinement, or verbal abuse were common. Enslaved women had to navigate this surveillance while managing the expectations of both field labor and domestic service. Their physical and emotional resilience was tested daily. In addition, the sexual exploitation of enslaved women remained a pervasive threat. Male owners and overseers saw these women as property, often justifying assault as a natural entitlement of their power. Pregnancies resulting from such abuse were used to increase the enslaved workforce, reinforcing the economic motivation behind the sexual violence. Plantation life, therefore, was not merely a story of work. It was a system of control that intertwined physical labor, sexual exploitation, and psychological domination. Women were central to this system, bearing immense burdens while simultaneously finding ways to preserve their humanity. Their endurance, ingenuity, and cultural resilience became crucial for survival, forming a legacy of strength that would echo through generations. Understanding the realities of plantation life is essential to comprehending the full scope of slavery, particularly the gendered experiences that defined the exploitation of enslaved women. One of the most insidious aspects of slavery was the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, a brutal reality that compounded their physical and psychological suffering. Enslaved women were subjected not only to the grueling labor of fields and households, but also to a constant threat of sexual violence at the hands of their owners, overseers, and sometimes even other men in positions of power within the colony. This exploitation was systemic, rooted in both the economic interests of slaveholders and the racist ideology that portrayed black women as inherently lustful or morally inferior. Sexual assault served multiple purposes for slaveholders. Economically, pregnancies resulting from sexual abuse increased the enslaved population, providing more laborers without the need to purchase additional individuals. Women were valued not just for their labor, but for their ability to reproduce future generations of slaves. This meant that many women were forced into repeated sexual encounters against their will, their bodies treated as property to maximize profit. Socially, sexual domination reinforced the hierarchical structure of slavery, reminding enslaved people of their lack of autonomy and the total control of their masters over every aspect of their lives. Historical records, though incomplete due to deliberate silences, provide evidence of the widespread nature of this abuse. For instance, in French colonies such as Saint-Domingue and Ile Royale, archival documents show that women like Louise, a Panisse slave, were purchased and then impregnated by their owners or other white men with little recourse or protection. Some women bore multiple children from these encounters, highlighting the systemic nature of sexual exploitation. In other cases, women like Marie-Louise, a slave in Louisbourg, were coerced into sexual relationships by their owners, resulting in numerous illegitimate children. These women endured not only physical violation, but also the emotional trauma of forced motherhood, often while continuing their labor and household duties. Enslaved women's reproductive labor was closely monitored and controlled. Births were recorded in plantation or church registers, and children were automatically considered property of the owner. Women had no legal standing to protect themselves or their children. Pregnancy did not exempt them from labor. They were expected to continue working in the fields or household, often under conditions that jeopardized their own health and that of their unborn children. Many children born under such conditions were separated from their mothers, sold to other plantations, or raised by other enslaved women, perpetuating a cycle of maternal loss and trauma. Resistance, however, persisted even under these horrific circumstances. Some women used their sexual relationships strategically, negotiating small favors or improved conditions for themselves or their children. Others sought spiritual or communal support, maintaining networks of solidarity with other enslaved women. Despite these acts of resistance, the imbalance of power was overwhelming. The law and social customs provided no protection, and any assertion of autonomy could lead to brutal punishment. The sexual violence and reproductive control of enslaved women left lasting consequences. Beyond the immediate physical and emotional harm, these practices shaped perceptions of black female sexuality that endured long after slavery's formal abolition. Stereotypes portraying black women as hypersexual or morally loose originated from this systemic abuse and were used to justify ongoing oppression during the Jim Crow era and beyond. Understanding this aspect of slavery is essential, as it reveals how exploitation was both a tool of economic gain and a method of enforcing social dominance. The trauma inflicted upon enslaved women and their children underscores the brutal reality of slavery and the resilience of those who endured its most intimate forms of violence. For enslaved women, motherhood was both a source of profound love and unbearable hardship. The institution of slavery systematically undermined family bonds, treating children and parents as property rather than as individuals with rights and agency. Enslaved mothers faced constant threats of separation, their children sold to distant plantations or forced to serve different households. Despite these conditions, women cultivated resilience, creativity, and strategies to preserve family and community in an environment designed to destroy it. Motherhood for enslaved women was a uniquely difficult experience. Pregnant women continued to work in the fields or domestic spaces, often under harsh physical conditions that jeopardized their health and the survival of their unborn children. Births were frequently attended not by medical professionals, but by other enslaved women relying on traditional knowledge, herbs, and practices passed down through generations. After giving birth, mothers were expected to return almost immediately to labor, leaving their infants in the care of older children, fellow slaves, or informal caretakers. The constant juggling of reproductive responsibilities alongside labor obligations exemplified the heavy, uncompensated burden placed on enslaved women. Family life, when it existed, was tenuous. Legal systems did not recognize marriages or unions among enslaved people, giving owners the authority to sell, relocate, or punish any family member at will. Husbands could be separated from wives, children from parents, with no recourse. Despite this, enslaved women fought to maintain family structures in subtle and persistent ways. They established close-knit networks of mutual support, with older women mentoring younger ones, sharing childcare responsibilities, and offering guidance on navigating plantation life. These networks were often critical to survival, helping preserve cultural traditions, language, and communal identity. Resistance manifested in many forms. Enslaved mothers sometimes deliberately stayed close to their children, even if it meant sacrificing opportunities for personal freedom or escape. They taught their children survival strategies, spiritual practices, and cultural knowledge, ensuring that future generations could retain a sense of identity even under oppression. Some mothers negotiated with their owners, using their labor, or, in some cases, limited acquiescence to sexual coercion to gain better conditions for themselves or their children. These acts of negotiation and survival demonstrate the agency enslaved women could exercise within an otherwise completely controlled environment. Children born into slavery faced lifelong vulnerability. They inherited their mother's status as property, with their lives determined by the economic and social interests of the slaveholders. Enslaved women were forced to endure the pain of watching their children subjected to the same conditions they themselves had suffered: forced labor, sexual exploitation, and the constant threat of separation. These realities created intergenerational trauma, but they also fostered extraordinary resilience as women adapted, protected, and guided their families despite extreme adversity. Spiritual life played a critical role in sustaining enslaved families. Enslaved women often acted as cultural and spiritual leaders, maintaining rituals, songs, and oral histories that reinforced community bonds and moral frameworks. Religious practices provided a source of hope, a sense of justice, and a framework for understanding suffering. The ability to nurture and protect family, even in small ways, was a profound act of resistance, asserting humanity in a system designed to deny it. Understanding the experiences of family and motherhood among enslaved women reveals the complexity of their resilience. They endured sexual exploitation, forced labor, and legal invisibility, yet they maintained networks of care, identity, and resistance. Their struggles illuminate the enduring power of love, communal solidarity, and strategic agency, demonstrating that even under the harshest oppression, enslaved women were not passive victims. They were active survivors, protectors, and transmitters of culture, knowledge, and hope. Even after the abolition of slavery, the exploitation and oppression of Black women persisted in new forms, leaving a lasting legacy that continues to shape society today. The social, economic, and sexual abuses inflicted upon enslaved women were deeply embedded in the fabric of American life, and these legacies were perpetuated through stereotypes, systemic racism, and discriminatory practices. Understanding the post-slavery era requires examining both the continuity of oppression and the resilience of Black women in navigating these hostile social structures. One of the most enduring consequences of slavery was the hypersexualization of Black women. During slavery, white slave owners justified sexual exploitation by portraying Black women as naturally promiscuous, morally loose, and sexually insatiable. These dehumanizing narratives transformed into cultural stereotypes that persisted long after emancipation. The Jezebel archetype, portraying black women as seductive and morally corrupt, became a central trope in literature, media, and social discourse. It framed black women's sexuality as inherently deviant, providing ideological justification for continued sexual harassment, assault, and exploitation. The Jezebel stereotype reduced black women to their bodies, erasing individuality, agency, and humanity. These stereotypes were reinforced and institutionalized during the Jim Crow era and under black codes, when systemic racism and segregation codified social hierarchies. Despite the formal end of slavery following the Civil War, black women were frequently denied access to justice, healthcare, and economic opportunities. They were disproportionately subjected to sexual abuse by white men, with minimal legal recourse, or protection. The hypersexualized image of black women was used to excuse these abuses, suggesting that they were naturally tempting or complicit, even when they had no power to consent. This cultural framework perpetuated cycles of trauma and reinforced social inequalities across generations. Medical and reproductive abuses also reflected the lingering legacy of slavery. Black women were subjected to unethical experimentation, compulsory sterilization, and denial of reproductive rights well into the 20th century. These practices were rooted in the same dehumanizing logic that had governed slavery, treating black female bodies as objects for economic and scientific exploitation rather than autonomous individuals. Access to quality healthcare remained limited, with poverty, racism, and social marginalization compounding these inequities. As a result, disparities in maternal health, reproductive justice, and overall well-being continue to disproportionately affect black women today. The cultural impact of slavery extended beyond healthcare and sexuality. Stereotypes and discriminatory narratives influenced education, media, and public perception, framing black women as other and reinforcing their social marginalization. Films, literature, and advertisements often depicted black women in derogatory ways, perpetuating myths of hypersexuality, servitude, or moral inferiority. Even when black women achieved success, they faced skepticism, bias, and systemic barriers rooted in centuries of oppression. These cultural legacies are interwoven with historical realities, creating a persistent social landscape shaped by the long shadow of slavery. Yet, despite these challenges, black women have demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Across generations, they resisted oppression, maintained cultural traditions, advocated for justice, and fought for recognition of their humanity. Figures such as Maria W. Stewart, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and countless unnamed women exemplify courage and agency, challenging stereotypes and asserting rights to bodily autonomy, education, and political participation. Their efforts laid the groundwork for modern movements advocating for civil rights, reproductive justice, and gender equity. Understanding the legacy of slavery is essential not only for historical comprehension, but for recognizing its ongoing social impact. The exploitation, sexualization, and systemic oppression endured by enslaved women did not end with emancipation. They evolved into cultural myths, institutional policies, and social attitudes that continued to affect black women for centuries. Confronting this legacy requires both historical reflection and active efforts to dismantle the structural inequalities that persist today, honoring the resilience, courage, and humanity of those who endured and resisted centuries of oppression. Despite the oppressive structures of slavery, enslaved women demonstrated remarkable resilience, resourcefulness, and agency. Their strategies of resistance and survival were diverse, ranging from subtle everyday acts to organized rebellions. Understanding how enslaved women navigated the brutal realities of slavery highlights their strength and ingenuity, and it challenges the false narratives that portray them solely as passive victims. Resistance took many forms, both overt and covert. Some women engaged in acts of physical defiance, such as escaping from plantations, participating in rebellions, or sabotaging crops and equipment. Though dangerous and often punishable by severe violence, these actions were powerful assertions of autonomy. Women also resisted through refusal, resisting sexual advances, labor demands, or participation in acts designed to benefit their oppressors. In many cases, resistance involved calculated negotiation, using limited influence to improve conditions for themselves or their children. For example, enslaved women in domestic positions sometimes leveraged their proximity to owners to secure better treatment, access to food, or protection from harsher labor. Cultural and spiritual practices were crucial tools of resistance and survival. Enslaved women preserved African traditions, music, and religious practices, maintaining a sense of identity and community even under systemic oppression. Spiritual rituals, storytelling, and communal gatherings provided emotional support and a framework for coping with trauma. These practices reinforced solidarity among enslaved women and men, enabling them to navigate the relentless pressures of plantation life. Music and oral traditions often carried coded messages of hope and resistance, allowing women to communicate and sustain morale in ways that were difficult for overseers to detect or suppress. Motherhood and family were also central arenas of agency. Enslaved women worked tirelessly to protect their children, often seeking to shield them from the most dangerous labor, harsh punishment, or sexual exploitation. They sometimes made the painful choice to remain on plantations to ensure their children's survival, sacrificing personal freedom to protect the next generation. These choices demonstrate that agency under slavery was not always about escape or rebellion. It was often about survival, strategy, and care within an environment designed to strip them of control. Education and skill development were additional forms of subtle resistance. Some women learned to read, write, or acquire trades despite prohibitions, enabling them to communicate, manage households, or gain relative influence on plantations. Literacy and specialized skills sometimes allowed women to negotiate improved conditions or earn small privileges, illustrating the resourcefulness they employed in navigating the systemic constraints of slavery. The legacies of enslaved women's resistance are profound. Even in circumstances designed to deny them autonomy, women found ways to assert control over aspects of their lives, preserve cultural identity, and protect loved ones. Their resilience challenged the dehumanizing assumptions of slaveholders and created networks of knowledge and solidarity that would endure across generations. These acts of resistance were both personal and communal, reflecting the broader struggle for dignity, agency, and humanity under a system that sought to deny all three. In understanding the resistance, survival, and agency of enslaved women, it becomes clear that slavery was not merely a story of oppression, but also one of courage, creativity, and endurance. The strategies women employed, whether overt defiance, negotiation, cultural preservation, or protection of family, illuminate the depth of their humanity and the ongoing impact of their strength. Recognizing these actions is essential for appreciating the full complexity of enslaved women's lives and honoring the legacy of resilience that continues to inspire generations today. The abolition of slavery in the United States through the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment marked a legal end to chattel slavery. But for Black women, freedom did not mean safety, equality, or autonomy. The post-emancipation era, especially during the Jim Crow period, presented new challenges that perpetuated many forms of oppression experienced under slavery. Systemic racism, legal segregation, and the enduring stereotypes of Black women as hypersexual and morally deviant ensured that the abuse, exploitation, and marginalization of Black women continued long after slavery's formal end. Jim Crow laws, enforced from the late 19th century into the mid-20th century, codified racial segregation in nearly every aspect of public and private life, from schools and transportation to healthcare and employment. Black women were forced into low-paying, labor-intensive jobs such as domestic work, agricultural labor, and factory work, mirroring the economic exploitation of slavery. The work was physically demanding, exhausting, and often carried no legal protections. Employers frequently assumed near total control over the laborers, perpetuating dynamics of power reminiscent of plantation life. Black women were disproportionately subjected to sexual harassment and abuse, and the law offered little recourse. Cultural stereotypes, rooted in the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, were central to maintaining this system. The Jezebel stereotype portraying Black women as promiscuous, seductive, and morally lax was widely propagated in literature, media, and public discourse. These stereotypes were used to justify sexual assault, deny Black women autonomy, and frame their behavior as inherently immoral. Black women accused of any sexual impropriety were often disbelieved, punished, or shamed, while white men faced few consequences for sexual misconduct. This persistent hypersexualization created an environment where Black women's bodies continued to be controlled and commodified. Black codes, which preceded and overlapped with Jim Crow laws, further restricted Black freedom and economic opportunity. These laws limited the ability of Black women to own property, control wages, or access education, ensuring continued dependence on white employers. Black women were often coerced into exploitative labor arrangements under the guise of legal authority, reflecting the continuity of systemic control from slavery to freedom. Denied access to resources, legal protections, and societal respect, they faced compounded forms of oppression: racial, economic, and gendered. Healthcare and reproductive rights were also deeply affected. Black women were subjected to medical experimentation, forced sterilization, and neglect in medical institutions. Poverty, segregation, and systemic racism limited access to quality healthcare, resulting in higher rates of maternal and infant mortality, untreated illnesses, and generational health disparities. Reproductive autonomy remained a central site of control, as the bodies of Black women were politicized and exploited long after emancipation. Despite these oppressive conditions, Black women continued to resist and assert agency. They organized grassroots movements, fought for education, advocated for civil rights, and created supportive communities to protect children and families. Activists like Maria W. Stewart, Ida B. Wells, and countless local leaders emphasized the humanity and rights of Black women, challenging both cultural stereotypes and institutionalized discrimination. Their work laid the foundation for later civil rights and feminist movements, highlighting the enduring struggle for justice and equality. Understanding post-emancipation struggles and the Jim Crow era is essential to recognizing the continuity of oppression from slavery to modern times. Black women's experiences reveal how systemic racism, sexual exploitation, and economic marginalization persisted under new legal and social frameworks. Yet, their resilience, resourcefulness, and resistance also demonstrate the ongoing fight for dignity, autonomy, and equality. A fight that remains deeply relevant in contemporary society. The legacies of slavery, sexual exploitation, and systemic oppression continue to impact Black women today, particularly in the areas of reproductive health, sexuality, and access to justice. Understanding these contemporary implications requires examining the historical roots of discrimination and how they manifest in modern institutions, healthcare, and societal attitudes. The struggle for reproductive justice is deeply intertwined with the experiences of enslaved women, revealing a continuity of challenges and resilience that spans centuries. Reproductive health disparities among Black women are closely linked to historical exploitation. During slavery, women were subjected to forced pregnancies, sexual violence, and deliberate interference with their reproductive choices. These abuses were justified by racist ideologies that treated Black women as property and as hypersexual beings. In the modern era, echoes of this history are evident in higher maternal mortality rates, limited access to quality healthcare, and disproportionately high rates of reproductive coercion. Studies show that Black women in the United States are more likely to experience complications during pregnancy and childbirth, often due to systemic bias, under-resourced medical facilities, and delayed or inadequate care. These disparities reflect the enduring structural inequities rooted in centuries of oppression. Compulsory sterilizations and medical experimentation in the 20th century further exemplify the continuation of reproductive injustice. Black women, along with other marginalized populations, were subjected to involuntary sterilizations, often without informed consent or under coercive circumstances. These actions were justified through persistent racialized stereotypes of Black women as overly fertile, sexually promiscuous, or unfit to parent. The consequences of such practices have had lasting effects, contributing to intergenerational trauma, mistrust of medical institutions, and ongoing challenges in accessing reproductive care and family planning resources. Beyond healthcare, social and cultural perceptions of Black women continue to be shaped by historical stereotypes. The Jezebel myth, which originated during slavery, continues to influence how Black women are perceived and treated in society. Black women are often hypersexualized in media, scrutinized for their sexual behavior, and denied the agency afforded to others in navigating intimate relationships. These stereotypes not only affect personal interactions, but also reinforce systemic biases in education, employment, and criminal justice, contributing to a persistent cycle of marginalization. Activism and advocacy have been critical in addressing these contemporary challenges. Movements focused on reproductive justice emphasize the right of Black women to have full autonomy over their bodies, access to health care, and the ability to make informed choices about family planning and sexual health. Organizations, community leaders, and healthcare advocates work to dismantle structural barriers, promote culturally competent care, and challenge discriminatory policies that echo the legacies of slavery. Education, awareness, and policy reform are key components in creating equitable systems that honor the humanity and dignity of Black women. The intersection of race, gender, and historical trauma underscores the importance of understanding contemporary reproductive justice within the broader context of systemic oppression. Black women's experiences today cannot be separated from the historical realities of slavery, sexual exploitation, and post-emancipation marginalization. By acknowledging this history, society can better address the inequities that persist and support the empowerment, health, and well-being of Black women. Their ongoing resilience, advocacy, and leadership demonstrate the enduring capacity to resist oppression and assert autonomy, building on a legacy of survival, courage, and agency. Understanding these contemporary implications is not only a matter of historical reckoning, but also of social responsibility. It challenges us to confront persistent inequities, honor the struggles of those who came before, and ensure that Black women have the protections, resources, and recognition necessary to fully exercise their rights and freedoms in modern society. The experiences of enslaved Black women, while historically marginalized, have increasingly become the subject of scholarly research, public history projects, and cultural memory initiatives. Remembering and recognizing the histories of these women is essential not only for honoring their struggles, but also for understanding the roots of contemporary racial and gender inequalities. Cultural memory, how societies choose to remember and interpret the past, plays a crucial role in shaping collective identity, social justice efforts, and public discourse. Historically, the stories of enslaved women were often silenced. Archival records frequently minimized or erased evidence of sexual violence, forced labor, and the complex social roles women held within enslaved communities. Male-centered narratives of slavery dominated historical accounts, leaving women's voices largely absent. The few records that do survive, such as baptismal registers, estate inventories, letters, and legal documents, reveal the scale of abuse, resilience, and agency among enslaved women. Historians have increasingly focused on these sources to reconstruct the lived experiences of women, revealing patterns of exploitation, survival strategies, and resistance that had been overlooked for centuries. Public history initiatives, including museums, memorials, and digital archives, are helping to make these narratives more visible. Exhibitions on slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and Black women's contributions often highlight both the brutality of oppression and the resilience of the enslaved. These spaces serve as educational tools, challenging audiences to confront the realities of slavery beyond simplified or sanitized accounts. For example, sites such as the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana specifically center the experiences of enslaved women, emphasizing family life, labor, and sexual exploitation. By foregrounding these stories, cultural institutions help the public recognize the depth of suffering and resistance inherent in the enslaved women's experience. Education also plays a pivotal role in historical recognition. Curricula that include gendered perspectives on slavery, the sexual exploitation of Black women, and the legacies of slavery foster a more nuanced understanding of American history. Incorporating these narratives into classrooms allows students to engage critically with systemic oppression, racialized stereotypes, and the intersections of gender and race. It also creates opportunities to discuss resilience, community building, and the long-term consequences of historical injustices in shaping modern society. Literature, film, and the arts are additional vehicles for cultural memory. Novels, documentaries, and theater productions have portrayed the experiences of enslaved women with emotional depth and historical accuracy, giving life to stories that archival documents alone cannot fully convey. Creative works allow audiences to empathize with the struggles of enslaved women, understand the systemic nature of their oppression, and appreciate the strategies of survival and resistance they employed. By shaping public imagination, these cultural representations challenge stereotypes, humanize historical actors, and provide moral and ethical frameworks for interpreting the past. Recognition of the experiences of enslaved women also has contemporary, social implications. Acknowledging historical sexual violence, forced labor, and systemic oppression illuminates the roots of modern disparities in health, economic opportunity, and social justice. It emphasizes the need for equity-driven policies, culturally competent healthcare, and social reforms that honor the humanity and agency of Black women. Cultural memory ensures that these histories are not forgotten, providing moral and ethical guidance for society to confront enduring legacies of injustice. Ultimately, the recognition and remembrance of enslaved Black women's experiences is a process of both historical recovery and social responsibility. By centering these narratives, historians, educators, and cultural institutions honor the resilience, courage, and agency of women who endured unimaginable hardships. They also challenge audiences to reflect critically on the continuing impact of slavery and systemic oppression, fostering awareness, empathy, and action. Cultural memory thus becomes not merely a record of the past, but a tool for understanding, justice, and transformation in the present. The history of enslaved Black women is both harrowing and enlightening. It reveals the extremes of human cruelty while simultaneously demonstrating extraordinary resilience, courage, and agency. As we reflect on this history, it is critical to consider the lessons it offers for contemporary society, particularly in areas of justice, equity, and the recognition of humanity. Understanding these lessons requires careful attention to the systemic patterns that allowed oppression to flourish, as well as the strategies of survival and resistance that shaped the lives of enslaved women. One of the most powerful lessons is the importance of recognizing systemic oppression in all its forms. Slavery was not simply a series of isolated abuses. It was an institutional system that regulated every aspect of enslaved women's lives. Their labor, bodies, sexuality, and family relationships were all controlled to benefit the economic and social interests of slaveholders. This historical reality illuminates the ways modern systems of inequality, whether in healthcare, education, criminal justice, or employment, can perpetuate similar patterns of disadvantage and marginalization. By studying the structures that upheld slavery, society can better identify and dismantle inequities that persist today. Another lesson lies in the resilience and agency of enslaved women. Despite facing unimaginable oppression, women employed strategies to protect themselves, their families, and their communities. They navigated power dynamics, preserved cultural traditions, and nurtured the next generation. Resistance took many forms, from small acts of defiance and negotiation to maintaining family bonds and spiritual practices. These strategies illustrate that even in contexts designed to deny autonomy, people can exercise creativity, resourcefulness, and agency. Recognizing this resilience allows us to honor the strength of those who endured and survived historical trauma. Reflection also demands an honest reckoning with cultural memory and societal responsibility. Many historical narratives have erased or minimized the experiences of Black women, perpetuating myths and stereotypes that continue to harm communities today. By acknowledging the sexual exploitation, forced labor, and systemic marginalization endured by enslaved women, society confronts the long-term consequences of these injustices. This awareness is essential for building a more equitable world, as it encourages empathy, critical thinking, and action to redress both historical and ongoing disparities. Moving forward requires active engagement with the legacies of slavery. Efforts to ensure reproductive justice, equitable healthcare, and protection from sexual exploitation are directly connected to the historical experiences of enslaved women. Advocacy, policy reform, and community support are crucial in addressing the structural inequities that persist across generations. Education plays a pivotal role as teaching accurate, gender-conscious histories fosters understanding and prepares future generations to recognize and challenge injustice. Finally, the stories of enslaved women serve as a source of inspiration. Their courage, endurance, and moral strength illuminate what is possible even in the face of overwhelming adversity. By learning from their experiences, society can cultivate a culture of justice, respect, and human dignity. Honoring their legacy means not only remembering the atrocities they endured, but also celebrating the ways they shaped culture, community, and resilience. It is a call to action, a reminder that the fight for equity, respect, and autonomy continues, and that the lessons of history are vital guides in this ongoing struggle. In conclusion, the history of enslaved Black women is a profound teacher. It highlights the destructive power of oppression, the resilience of the human spirit, and the importance of memory, reflection, and action. By internalizing these lessons, society can work toward a future where justice, dignity, and equality are not ideals, but lived realities for all. The legacy of enslaved women reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, courage, agency, and hope endure, guiding us toward a more just and humane world.